Please don't sell me to them. The chained alien girl begged the quiet human pilot, and Reed Vega, who had spent 9 years building a life around not stopping for things he could not fix, stopped. The Valegan Bazaar on Vakar smelled of cooked grain and rust and something faintly chemical that the wind off the dust plane pushed up between the rows of black tent cloth. The twin suns of the system pressed down on the tarp roofs and turned the whole sprawling market into a shifting lattice of red shadows. Reed was looking for a field coil. The one in the hollow knife had cracked along the inner mount 3 weeks ago, and Reed had been nursing it across 2 systems on prayer and the small art of not pushing his slip drive past 68%. He had a wad of salt credits in the inner pocket of his flight jacket, and a list in his head of 3 vendors who might have a Brennari-rated coil at a survivable price. He did not have a list of stops to make in the Slaver Alley, because the Slaver Alley was not a place a freight pilot of his intended longevity took shortcuts through. He took a shortcut through it anyway. The bazaar's main corridor was choked at midday with multi-species foot traffic, a Sodash carrier line bringing in salt blocks, a Voth dignitary's escort moving in formation, and Reed had needed the field coil 20 minutes ago. The Slaver Alley was a gap between the textile rows and the metalwork section, 4 tents wide, a dozen poles deep, and Reed had walked it twice before in his life, and both times he had walked it with his eyes locked on the gap at the far end and his mind closed against the noise on either side. He was 36 years old. He had a half-gray beard that he kept trimmed close and a pair of tired hazel eyes set deep under a brow that had been broken once a long time ago. He was Latino, born on a backwater colony moon in the dry system, raised by a working mother who had died when he was 19, and shaped after that by the kind of grief that did not give a person back to the world quickly. He stood 5 feet 10 and a half. He carried himself the way a man carries himself when he has finished apologizing for taking up his share of the air. He wore a dark olive flight jacket with a Brennari mechanics patch on the right shoulder, a black Henley underneath, gone gray at the collar from years of washing, faded sand-tan cargo pants, and worn brown boots that he resoled himself once a year. His ship was the Hollow Knife, a small 40-meter cargo hauler, painted matte charcoal with a single faded white stripe along her starboard flank. The registry numbers half-eaten by re-entry burn. She was parked in slip 19 of the Valegan groundside docks, 2 kilometers and 1 cracked field coil away from being able to carry him out of this city. He had told himself, walking into the alley, that he would keep his eyes forward. He had told himself, walking into the alley, that he would not look at the chained ones. He had told himself a great many things in 9 years of careful work and not breaking any of his own rules. And he had been good at telling himself things. He had been good at telling himself, after his sister Anita went missing on a colony run when he was 16, that there was nothing he could have done. He had been good at telling himself, when her body had been found in the cargo hold of a derelict trafficker's freighter 8 months later on the cold side of a world he had never seen, that this kind of thing happened, and that the people who did it could not be found, and that the grief inside him was a furnace he was going to have to keep banked low for the rest of his working life, or it would burn through the ship he was trying to build. He had been very good at telling himself things. The chained ones in the Slaver Alley made the telling difficult. Reed Vega put his head down. Reed Vega walked. The 3rd pole on the left side of the alley was where he heard the voice. It was small. It was rough from disuse and from breathing market dust for too long. It was speaking common galactic with the careful cadence of a person who had learned the language late, in captivity, by listening. Please, don't sell me to them. He was 4 steps past the pole before his body realized what his ears had heard. He turned around slowly, the way a man turns around when something inside him has just stopped working the way it has worked for a decade. She was sitting on the packed dirt at the foot of the third pole. She was small, slim, terribly underfed. With skin the soft lavender color of dusk on a temperate planet and faint silver constellation freckles scattered across her cheekbones and along her collarbones. Her hair was jet black at the roots, long and tangled, with a single thick streak of silver at the temple that suggested a Marili bloodline marker. Her eyes were emerald green, very large in her thin face, and ringed with the dark of long sleeplessness. She wore a torn ash-gray shift that covered her modestly to the knees, frayed at the hem, and a pair of bare feet that had been bare a long time. She was chained at the wrist to the pole by a heavy alloy cuff. The cuff was new. The pole was old. She was holding her chained hand carefully across her lap with her free hand, as if to spare it the ache. Her chin lifted as he turned. She watched him without expectation. She had learned, somewhere in her life, not to expect a man who turned around to be a man who would help. She said it again, very quietly, because the alley was loud, and she did not want to attract notice she did not need. Please, don't let them sell me to the Yannick. Reed stared at her. The word Yannick hit a small place inside him. He had heard the word Yannick in cantinas the way he had heard most words, dropped in passing, never explained. The Yannick conclave was a religious order that paid extravagant prices for certain alien children and certain alien young women under certain biological conditions. The conditions involved a particular pattern of heritage marker that the conclave used in their blood rites ceremonies. The young women so purchased did not return. Reed had filed the word away with all the other things in the galaxy that he could not fix. He came one step closer. He did not crouch yet. He kept his hands visible. He said, quiet, hard, low enough that the next pole over would not hear. "What's your name?" She blinked. She looked at the cuff on her wrist. She looked at the slaver's awning 10 meters down the alley, where the dealer was holding court with 3 robed figures in pale blue. The robed figures wore the slim curling sigil of the Yannick stitched in pale silver thread on the inside of their hoods. They were already negotiating. They were already finished negotiating. They were waiting for the cred chip to clear. She said, "My name is Lyra." She said, "They are going to come and take me before the next bell." Reed looked over his shoulder. The slaver caught his eye and gave him the small, careful smile of a vendor who recognizes a looky-loo and is prepared to be patient. Reed did not return the smile. He turned back to Lyra. He said, "How much?" She said, "I don't know. 8, 10? Reed said, 8 or 10 what? She said, 8 or 10,000 salt. Reed felt his gut go cold and then warm. The warmth being the warmth of the furnace he had kept banked for 19 years, rising for the first time since his sister had been buried. He had 8,400 salt credits in the inner pocket of his flight jacket. They were the salt credits for the field coil. They were the salt credits for the hollow knife to fly. They were the difference between him being on Vakar another 6 weeks and him being out of this system before the next station rotation. Reed's mind began to do, very calmly, the small math it had been trained over 9 years not to do. The field coil could be limped on for another month. He could pick up 2 short hauls inside the Vakar gravity well. He could borrow a temporary patch from a Brennari shipfitter named Austin, who he half-trusted. He could carry mid-distance freight at a discount until the next salt credit clearing. He could survive without the field coil. He could not survive looking himself in the mirror after walking past Lyra Marili at the third pole on the left side of the slaver alley, while a Yannick-robed figure paid the slaver 8,000 salt credits and led her away. He squatted down. He looked at her own eye level. He said, "Listen carefully." He said, I am going to do something that may go badly. He said, when it goes one way or the other, you will not look afraid. He said, you will look bored. He said, can you do that? Lyra's emerald eyes searched his face for something. He did not know what she was looking for. He let her look. After 8 seconds, she nodded. She made her face go bored. She did it like a person who had done it many times. He stood up. He walked over to the slaver. He said, I want a bid on the Marili at pole 3. The slaver's face changed in a controlled way. The slaver was a tall, 4-armed Voth with a lower mandible like a black sickle. The slaver said, that one is sold. Reed said, not until the credits clear. The slaver said, the credits clear in 7 minutes. Reed said, I will pay you more, in cash, salt, right now. The slaver paused. He looked at Reed the way a vendor looks at a man he has not yet decided is worth talking to. He named a price. The price was 9,000. Reed had 8,400. He said, 8,400. The slaver said no. Reed said, 8,400 and the tools out of my belt. He had a Brennari multitool and a survey kit clipped to his hip. The tools alone were worth maybe 700 in salt. The slaver looked at the tools. The slaver looked at the Yannick-robed figures still waiting under his awning, drumming their fingers on the cred chip pad. The slaver was now in the position of either offending a religious power that would remember, or making a clean sale to a freight pilot who would not. The slaver said, plus the jacket. Reed did not blink. He said, no. He said, 8,400, the tools, and the boots. The boots, as boots, were not worth much. The boots, as a public symbol that the freight pilot was now standing in dust to walk out of this alley, were worth a great deal to the slavers standing in the bazaar. The slaver paused again. The slaver smiled the controlled vendor smile. The slaver said, done. The Yannick-robed figures watched Reed count out salt credits onto the slaver's counting plate. They watched him unbuckle his Brennari multitool and his survey kit. They watched him bend down and unlace his brown boots and step out of them. They watched him stand barefoot in the packed dust of the Valegan slaver alley, with a small lavender alien woman now leaning against his hip, while the slaver applied an ident key to the wrist cuff, and the cuff fell away with a small mechanical sigh. The robed figures did not speak. The robed figures watched. The slaver wrote something on a strip of parchment and pressed it into Reed's palm. He said, certificate of transfer. Takes the matter off my book. Reed did not read it. Reed put the parchment in his jacket pocket, along with the empty space where his salt credits had been. He took Lyra by her unchained hand. He did not look at the Yannick-robed figures. He turned and walked her out of the alley. He walked the 2¼ kilometers back, to slip 19 of the groundside docks barefoot, on packed dirt, then on hot prefab metal of the docking gantries, then on warm steel of the boarding ramp of the hollow knife. Lyra walked beside him. She did not speak. She looked at the back of his neck for the entire walk. He sat her in the auxiliary bunk. He climbed up to the cockpit and ran the hollow knife's pre-flight in 72 seconds. He did not pay his slip fee. He did not file a departure plan. The dockmaster would charge him a re-registration penalty for both omissions, and he did not currently care. The hollow knife lifted out of slip 19 on her cracked field coil, and he climbed her up through the upper atmosphere of Vakar with his slip drive throttled at 58% because the field coil could not handle more. And he watched the long-range scope until the Yannick Conclave's small, fast hunter frigate appeared in low orbit and then fell behind as he punched into slip space at a barely acceptable angle. He had 90 seconds of real heart in his chest. The 73rd heartbeat was the moment the Yannick frigate's signature dropped off his scope, and the hollow knife was alone in the long quiet of slip transit. Reed sat back in his pilot chair. He realized he was barefoot. He realized he had no boots, no multitool, no survey kit, no salt credits, and no field coil. He had a Marili woman in his auxiliary bunk, who he had purchased 7 minutes ago from a Voth slaver in a public alley on a planet on no one's border. He had, by every calculation his 9-year career had taught him to make, made the worst trade of his working life. He laughed once, very quietly. The laugh you laugh when something inside you has come loose for the first time in a long time, and you do not know yet whether the looseness is going to be good for you. He stood up. He went down to the auxiliary bunk. Lyra was sitting on the edge of it, with her bare feet not quite touching the deck, looking at her hands. She looked up when he came down. He had a moment of seeing her properly in the warm light of the cabin for the first time. She was even smaller than she had looked in the alley. Her hair was longer than he had thought, and the silver streak at the temple was wider than he had thought. The constellation freckles across her cheekbones were faintly luminescent in the dim cabin light, soft silver against the lavender. She was 19 years old, he would learn later, although she looked younger because of the sustained malnutrition of the holding pens. Her wrist, where the cuff had been, was rubbed raw down to the underflesh. She had a thin, healed scar that ran from the corner of her left eye to her jaw. She had hands that had been held wrong for a long time. She watched him from the bunk with a careful, measured patience that he knew from the inside, because it was the same patience Anita had developed in their last year before she went away. Reed said, "My name is Reed Vega." He said, "You are not for sale." He said, "I have 8 ration bars and a half-cracked field coil and 40 light years between us, and any place I can think of dropping you that won't get you killed on arrival." He said, "We are going to figure this out together." Lyra Marili looked at him for a long count. Her emerald eyes did not change. Her chin lifted very slightly. She said, in the same small, careful, common galactic, "Then, we will figure it out." He nodded. He went back up to the cockpit. He set the autopilot for a long arc out toward the Maridor system, because Maridor was 4 jumps, and Maridor was where he kept a Brennari shipfitter contact named Austin, who would lend him a temporary patch on credit. He sat in the pilot chair for a long time, barefoot, watching the stars move past the viewport. He felt the furnace inside him, the one he had kept banked for 19 years, settle into a steady glow that was not as hot as he had feared it would be. It was the glow of a fire that was finally being fed properly. She did not speak again for 2 days. He did not push her. He had known since the alley that she had survived a very long time by being still. He gave her his bunk. He slept in the cockpit chair the way he had slept in the cockpit chair for stretches before. The way a man sleeps when he is willing to do what is needed. He left her ration bars and a cup of water near the bunk. He kept the cabin warm. He kept the lights low. He played no music. He worked the long, quiet hours of the first jump on the small repairs the hollow knife had been needing for a month and a half. He cleaned the recycler trap. He shimmed the port stabilizer. He did not look at the cracked field coil because looking at it would have done nothing for it. On the 3rd day, she came forward to the cockpit hatch. He had been aware of her without looking. He turned slowly in the pilot chair. She stood in the hatch frame in a Brennari travel robe he had pulled from his contraband locker the night before. The robe was pale gray, soft cloth, modest and warm. He had hung it on the bunk while she slept, and she had put it on the next morning. She looked, in the hold lighting, like a small lavender priestess in a large gray gown. She was barefoot. She held herself the way a person holds themselves who has not been allowed to choose where to stand for a very long time, and is now choosing and is finding the choosing unfamiliar. She said, in the same rough, careful, common galactic, "Can I sit?" Reed said, of course. He pointed to the second chair. She sat. She looked at the console. She looked at him. She said, "Why did you stop?" He had been waiting for this question. He had not been waiting in a planning way. He had been waiting in the way a man waits to be asked the question he has not been ready to answer for a long time, knowing the asking will come. He told her, in fewer words than he had ever told anyone, about Anita. His older sister, 16. He had been 13. She had taken a colony run on a small freighter that turned out not to have the licenses everyone had assumed, and she had not come home. Her body had been found 8 months later. He had been 19 by then. He had decided, the day he had stood at her grave on the colony moon, that he was going to spend his working life paying his fees, keeping his head down, not engaging, and hauling cargo along the cleanest routes he could find. He had made a discipline of not stopping for things. He told her this not because he wanted her to know it, but because it was the only honest answer to the question why. He said, "I stopped because she sounded like Anita." He said, "In my head she sounded like Anita." He said, "I would have walked past you 20 years ago." He said, "I am not the same man." Lyra listened to all of this without moving. The constellation freckles on her cheekbones brightened very faintly when he said his sister's name. After he was done, she said, "Your sister was loved." He said, "Yes." She said, "The people who were going to buy me, my sister was bought by them 6 years ago." She said, "My sister did not come home either." He looked at her. She looked at him. The space between them held the weight of 2 siblings who were not in this room and would not be coming back. He said, "What was your sister's name?" She said, "Velen." He said, "Velen Marili." She said, "Velen Marili." He said, "Anita Vega." She said, "Anita Vega." They sat for a long minute in the warm, dim light of the cabin, while 2 names that did not belong to the living were spoken into a ship that was going somewhere quieter than where they had been. She told him, over the next 4 days of the long arc out toward Meridor, the slow architecture of her life. She had been born on a moon called Halt that orbited a gas giant in the outer Marili holdings. Her family had been small farmers, raising a kind of root that grew in the volcanic ash of the moon's lowlands. Her father had been killed when she was 9 in a slaver raid that had also taken her older sister Velen. Her mother had moved them to a refugee enclave on a station called Bredza, and Lyra had grown up there for 6 years. Between the refugee schoolrooms and a Marili Healer's Apprentice program her mother had pushed her into because the Healer's Apprentice program protected its students from a kind of conscription the refugee status had not. The Healer's Apprentice program had also protected her, for a while, from the slaver raids that visited Bretza twice a year. It had not protected her at 15. When a Payan compact pirate had identified her bloodline marker in a routine medical scan run on the enclave by a corrupt registrar, and the next slaver raid had collected her specifically, by name, by serial. She had been 4 years in the holding pens of the Yannick-affiliated traffickers, kept fresh, fed adequately, kept healthy, awaiting a buyer for whom her bloodline was the qualifying ingredient. She did not describe what she knew about the blood right. She had been told what she would have been used for. She told Reed what she knew without effect, the way she had told everything else. He asked her, after the longest silence of the 4 days, what kept her alive. She said, "My mother said, 'When they took my sister, I will see you again, Lyra.' She said, 'My mother said it like a vow.' She said, 'I have been keeping the vow.' He said, 'Your mother is alive.' She said, 'My mother is alive.' She said, 'On Breza.' She said, 'I have not been able to write.'" Reed felt his heart settle inside his chest in a place it had not occupied since he was 13 years old. He said, "After Meridor, we will go to Bredza." He said, "After Maridor, we will write a letter and carry it ourselves." She did not say anything. The constellation freckles brightened by a measurable amount. Osen on Maridor took the hollow knife into the back of his shop the same hour they docked. Osen was a long-armed Brennari, 6 knuckled fingers per hand, gray carapace patched twice along the ribs from old cargo accidents. Osen looked at the cracked field coil, looked at Reed's bare feet, looked at Lyra in her travel robe, and made one small clicking sound at the back of his throat that was the Brennari equivalent of a long whistle. Osen said, "You are a gift to my retirement fund." Reed said, "I will pay you in installments." Osen said, "You will pay me in 2 months and a temporary patch and a story." Reed told Osen the short version. Osen listened the way Brennari listened, with the head tilted slightly, both eye stalks angled in. When Reed finished, Osen made another small click. Osen said, "The Yonic conclave will not forget." Reed said, "I know." Osen said, "You will need to disappear." Reed said, "I know." Osen said, "The Pa-In Compact has begun running bounty drops for a freight pilot named Reed Vega already." He had a station-printed ident tag with Reed's flat description on the back of his counter, fresh, 12 hours old. He showed it to Reed. Reed read it. He had a moment of his own description being printed by a power that wished him harm, the way it had been printed for Anita's killers 19 years ago, and had done nothing for her. He said, "I will need a new transponder." Osen said, "I will install one." He said, "You can pay me in the freight you owe me in a temporary patch, and we will call it square." Osen also fitted a third ident rotor into the hollow knife, so Reed could cycle through 3 call signs instead of 2. He installed a temporary field coil patch. He waved off the new bootstrap fee. Reed bought a cheap pair of brown work boots from the market across from Osen's shop, because Osen had told him only once, gently, that a barefoot freight pilot was a freight pilot drawing eyes. Reed bought boots. He bought a cheap multi-tool and a ration kit. He bought Lyra a pair of soft canvas shoes that almost fit, 2 extra travel robes in different colors, and a Marili-compatible toiletry kit. Lyra accepted all of these without comment. The constellation freckles brightened each time he handed her something. They left Maridor before the next station rotation. Reed put the hollow knife on a slow, careful arc out toward Bretsa. 4 jumps the long way around, threading systems that had no Pa-In compact presence and no Yonic shrines on record. Lyra began, somewhere on the 2nd jump, to do small things in the cabin without being asked. She fixed the recycler door latch, which had been sticking for 2 years. She straightened the bedding in the auxiliary bunk after she got out of it in the morning. She insisted on cooking a Marili stew on the small galley plate the 3rd night, with ingredients she scavenged from his ration store and a pinch of root spice from the Maridor market. The stew was better than anything Reed had eaten in 6 years. He ate 2 bowls and told her so. She did not smile. The constellation freckles brightened across her cheekbones in a way that he had begun to read, by then, as her smile. He told her that night, over the dishes, that he had been a brother to a sister who had liked stews. She nodded. She said, "What was Anita's favorite?" He said, "Lentil and root with cumin." She said, "I will make that." She did not say, "I will make that for you." She said, "I will make that." He understood, even barefoot in the small galley with his hands wet from washing the bowls, that she was also making it for Anita. The next morning, Lyra woke up before he did. He found her at the cockpit console, gently nudging the regulator a quarter turn the way a person nudges a regulator who has been raised with hands inside engines. He stood in the cockpit hatch and watched her work. She did not turn around. She knew he was there. She said, "The regulator is set wrong." He said, I know. She said, your sister would have liked the regulator set right. He laughed quietly, the way he had laughed once 7 days ago in slip space alone. She did not laugh. The constellation freckles brightened. He told her, in pieces over the 4 jumps, the small architecture of his life. He told her about the hollow knife and the savings he had built with his mother to buy her. He told her about the stretches of years where he had carried clean cargo on clean routes and had not engaged with anything that smelled like trouble. He told her about the cracked field coil and the manifests and the slow, simple math of paying his slip fees. She listened. She asked good questions. She asked about the engineering. She asked about the planet names. She asked about the Brennari and the Sodash and the Voth. And Reed told her what he knew, which was the surface texture of a galaxy he had moved through at the level of a freight pilot for 9 years. On the 4th jump, when they were 8 hours out of Brezza, she came forward to the cockpit and sat down in the second seat without asking. She had begun to do that now, without ceremony. He did not comment. She looked at him for a long time. She said, when we get to Brezza, you should not stay long. He said, I know. She said, the Yannick will find you, eventually. He said, I know. She said, when I see my mother, I will tell her about you. He said, you don't have to tell her about me. She said, I will tell her about you. He nodded. He kept flying. The hollow knife came into Brezza orbit at the long gray hour before the station's planetary night cycle, and Reed sat down at the small docking annex where Brezza's refugee enclave kept its private slips. He paid his slip fee. He did not file under his real ident. He climbed down the ramp with Lyra in a fresh dark gray travel robe, her constellation freckles bright in the dim, her wrist where the cuff had been now wrapped in a clean Brennari healing band. The enclave doorway was at the end of a covered walkway. He walked her there. He stopped at the threshold. He did not go in. He did not need to. She turned and looked up at him and put one slim lavender hand on the front of his flight jacket where his salt credit pocket had been. And she said, in the careful common galactic she had spoken in the alley, in a voice that was not small now, I will not forget you, Reed Vega. He said, you don't have to remember. She said, no, Reed. I will remember. She went through the doorway. The doorway closed. He stood at the threshold a little longer than he should have. He told himself, walking back to the hollow knife, that he had done what he could. He told himself that she would be safe. He told himself the kind of small things a man tells himself at the end of a thing he has done, that he does not entirely know how to grieve. He climbed the ramp. He sealed the lock. He sat in the cockpit chair for a long time before he set a course. The hollow knife lifted off Brezza groundside in the long gray pre-dawn and took him into a low arc out of the system before any Pine compact patroller could log her on entry. He did not look back. Looking back was not a skill he was going to relearn for a brief moment of catharsis at a refugee doorway. He spent the next 7 years quietly disappearing the way Ossen on Maridor had told him he would have to. He cycled through 3 transponder ident rotors. He pulled the hollow knife's registry markings and repainted them by hand twice. He took on freight runs that had no Yannick shrine within 60 light-years of either endpoint. He carried medical supplies into a Yannick-free refugee enclave on Hallan 9 during a spore plague. He carried farm equipment into the burn plains for 2 years, slow loads at low pay, paying the dock fees of 14 frontier outposts in honest salt credits. He paid Ossen back his temporary patch on the Marili stew schedule Lyra had taught him. 2 months and a story, then 4 months and another story, then 6 months and a Brennari festival gift that Ossen pretended to find embarrassing. He kept the certificate of transfer from the Valegan slaver in a small wooden box in the cabin drawer, beside a pair of canvas shoes too small for his own feet that he had bought for Lyra on Maridor. and that she had, on the fourth jump out, laughed once and given back to him as a thing she would not need where she was going. He kept the canvas shoes. He kept the cracked old field coil that Austin had pulled out of his hauler too in the same drawer, because he had wanted once to remember what it had looked like to be owned by a thing that was failing. The Yonic Conclave did not forget. The Conclave's hunter frigates intercepted the Hollow Knife twice in the first 3 years, both times on unpopulated frontier routes. Both times Reed had outrun them by a hand's breadth on the patched coil, threading a cinder belt the first time and a comet's coma the second. He picked up small smuggle resistance work along the way without intending to. He carried fugitive Marili children for free, 3 over the 7 years, when their handlers asked. He carried a Sodash defector in a sealed crate one time for free, because the Sodash had asked in the cantina at Meridor with a small, careful voice Reed had learned to recognize. He did not advertise this work. He did not become known for it. He was known, when he was known, as a freight pilot with a quiet manner and a willingness to take hard routes for fair prices and a habit of not asking too many questions about origin or destination. Inside himself, he understood that he had become, in small, careful steps, a different sort of man than the one who had walked into the Valegan slaver alley looking for a field coil. He did not announce this to himself. He simply lived in it. He did not see Lyra Marili in any of those 7 years. He did not write her. He understood that writing her was a thing that could be intercepted, traced, used. He had, instead, the small ritual of pulling out the canvas shoes from the cabin drawer once a season and holding them in his palm and remembering. He understood, in that quiet way, a working man understands the things he does without explanation, that he was waiting. He did not know what he was waiting for. He kept the field coil running half a degree warm because Austin's patch ran half a degree warm, and he had grown, over the 7 years, to like the small unevenness of it. He turned 43 on a frontier station called Cold Arrow, alone, with a Brennari mechanic he half trusted and a small bottle of Sodash spirits Austin had sent him in the season's mail. He drank 1 finger of the Sodash spirits in honor of his sister Anita, 1 finger in honor of Valegan Marili, and 1 finger in honor of the woman who had asked him to stop. He did not drink the rest of the bottle. He put the cork back in. He went to bed early. He slept the way a man sleeps when he has spent his furnace properly, and there is no longer any heat that needs to be banked. Only the steady warmth of work that has been done and continues to be done. In the 3rd year, he was hailed by a Sodash freight cooperative on the Halen 9 axis who had heard, through the slow gossip of cantinas and ship chandleries, that there was a quiet human pilot working the back routes who would sometimes carry for free a thing that needed to be carried for free. They paid him in introductions. The introductions led to other introductions. He never advertised. He never asked. He took the runs that came to him through the small grapevine of refugee enclaves and Brennari shipfitters and Sodash defectors and the occasional Marili matron with a trembling courier. He carried, in those 4 hidden years between the 3rd and the 7th, 11 Marili children, 2 Voth dissidents, a single Drekai apostate priest, and a Yonic-marked Salari girl, whose handler had begged him in the cantina at Cold Arrow to take her to a Brennari healer 2 systems out. He took her. The Brennari healer paid him, against his refusal, in a single Marili root spice that he kept in a small jar in the galley, and used sparingly, only on stews, only on the days he was tired enough to need a kind of warmth that could not be banked. He kept the certificate of transfer from the Valegan slaver in the small wooden box in the cabin drawer. He kept the canvas shoes Lyra had given back to him. He kept, in the bottom of the box, a slip of paper from the Meridor market with Austin's installments printed on it. 6 rows neatly checked off. He kept the cracked old field coil. He kept a small braid of Brennari wire that Austin had once used to hold a hollow knife panel shut after a docking mishap on outer cinder, because the wire had been all that had stood between him and a depressurization, and he had wanted to remember. He did not keep photographs. He had not kept photographs since Anita. He kept instead the smell of the Marili stew that Lyra had cooked on his fourth jump out of Marador, the way she had pinched the root spice into the pot, the way she had said quietly that the regulator was set wrong. He kept the way she had said his name in the alley. He kept the way the Voth slaver's awning had slanted at midday under the twin suns. He kept the way the dust had felt under his bare feet on the walk to slip 19. He kept the 7 minutes he had had for his heart to settle in the cockpit of the hollow knife after the Yannick frigate's signature had dropped off the scope. He kept all of it. He did not unpack any of it. He flew. He thought sometimes, on the longer jumps, about what Anita would have made of him. He thought she would have laughed at the boots. He thought she would have made him a stew and would not have said anything about the field coil. He thought she would have liked Lyra. He thought she would have liked Valegan Marili too, although she had not lived to meet either of them. He thought of his mother, and of how his mother had told him, in the Colony Moon kitchen of his 13th year, that what you did was who you were. He thought of the way the Valegan slaver had paused before he said done. He thought of the constellation freckles brightening under cabin light. He thought of all of it, in the small, private way a working man thinks on long jumps, and he kept flying. The 7th year of his disappearing was the year he learned, from a passing Brennari courier on Cold Arrow, that the Yannick Conclave's senior counsel had been quietly removed from power in a Marili diplomatic action, and that the Conclave's trafficking lines had been formally dismantled by the Marili humanitarian flag, which had been granted 3 years before, an unusual and specific writ of protected carriage in the rim systems. He did not at the time connect the writ of protected carriage to the small lavender woman he had walked to a refugee enclave doorway 7 years before. He filed the news away. He kept flying. She came for him on the 7th anniversary of the Valegan Alley, almost to the day. He had been hauling a load of grain seed into a refugee colony on the outer cinder rim when his comm chimed an unsigned hailing tone he did not recognize. The voice on the other end was older than the one in his memory, but had the same careful cadence of common galactic learned late in difficulty and held since. The voice said, "Reed Vega, the freight pilot. This is Lyra Marili, the Marili healer." The voice said, "I would like to find you." He sat back in his pilot chair. He felt the 7 years rearrange themselves in his chest. He said, "I am at the outer cinder refugee dock, slip 7. She said, "I am at the Marador station." She said, "May I come?" He said yes. He waited at slip 7 for 41 hours. He paid the slip extension fee himself. He swept the cargo bay clean and ran the recycler 1 extra cycle. He did not tell himself this was preparation. He did not tell himself anything. The Marili courier ship that came in on the 2nd day was a small, clean cutter, with the soft, pale blue lattice markings of a registered Marili humanitarian vessel. It set down in slip 9, 2 slips over from the hollow knife. The ramp came down. Reed Vega stood at the bottom of his own ramp and watched a small lavender woman in a healer's gray and white robe walk across the docking apron toward him. She was 26 years old. She was no longer thin. She held herself like a person who had been making her own choices for a long time. The constellation freckles across her cheekbones were brighter than he remembered, fed by health and time and the practice of using them. Her jet-black hair was now woven into a single long Marili healer's braid down her back. The silver streak at the temple wider, the silver tips at the bottom of the braid catching the docking lights. She wore Marili healer's robes in pale sky gray, with a small bronze caduceus pinned at the throat. She wore good leather sandals. She walked the way a person walks who has not been afraid in a long time. She stopped 3 feet from him at the foot of the ramp. She looked up at him. She said, "You are barefoot." He looked down. He had been changing the recycler trap an hour ago and had forgotten his boots. He said, "I was working." She said, "I remember." They did not embrace. They did not touch. She said, "May I come up?" He said, "Yes." They sat in the small galley at the same table where he had once eaten her stew. She had brought a wrapped parcel. She set it on the table between them and did not open it yet. She said, "I have come, in part, to ask you to do a thing." He said, "Name it." She said, "On Bredza, my mother runs a small refuge for Marili children, rescued from holding pens of the kind I was kept in." She said, "The refuge has been operating for 5 years." She said, "My mother named it for my sister." She said, "The Velen Refuge." He felt the breath catch behind his sternum. She said, "The Velen Refuge has, this year, secured charter as a registered humanitarian carrier under the Marili flag." She said, "We have a vessel." She said, "We have a route." She said, "We do not have yet a pilot we trust." She said, "I have come to ask if you would consider being our pilot." He looked at her. She did not press. She did not push. She had asked, the way she had asked in the Valegan slaver alley 7 years ago, with the quiet patience of a person who had learned not to expect a man who turned around to be a man who would help. He said, "What would the work be?" She said, "Hauling rescued children to the refuge." She said, 4 to 12 at a time. She said, "On routes the Yannick conclave can no longer touch, because the Marili humanitarian flag is now diplomatically protected." She said, "The work would not pay." She said, "The refuge would house your ship, refuel her, maintain her." She said, "You would have a bunk and a galley and the company of other adults who have stopped, the way you stopped." She said, "I would not be able to pay you in salt." She said, "I would be able to pay you in, perhaps, the small dignity of a thing being done." He thought about it. He had been thinking about it, in pieces, for 7 years without knowing he had been thinking about it. He said, "What is the ship's name?" She said, "My mother named the ship as well." She said, "The ship is called Anita." She had asked him, on the cabin deck of the Hollow Knife 7 years ago, what his sister's name had been, and he had given it to her. And her mother had remembered. And her mother had named the ship that would carry rescued Marili children, Anita Vega. He sat in the galley of his own hauler with a Marili healer across from him and felt his eyes go wet for the first time in 17 years. He did not turn his face away. She did not look away. She said, "You do not have to decide today." He said, "I have decided." She said, "All right." She said, "I will tell my mother." He said, "Please tell your mother." He said, "Please tell your mother thank you." She unwrapped the parcel between them. Inside were the 2 pairs of canvas shoes he had bought her on Meridor. They were small. They had been clean for a long time. She had kept them. She said, "I do not need these." She said, "You should keep them." She said also, she added, "I have brought you something else." From a fold inside the parcel she lifted a small bronze pin, shaped like the Marili caduceus, and she pressed it into his palm. She said, "You are now an honorary apprentice of the Velen Healer's Order." She said, "This means very little." She said, "It means, when you are tired and a Marili matron sees this on your jacket, you will be given a cup of soup without asking." He laughed once. He laughed for the first time in many years. She did not laugh, but the constellation freckles across her cheekbones brightened. He sold the hollow knife to Osen on Marador a season later. Osen took her at a fair price, more than fair, and stripped her useful parts and rebuilt her as a teaching ship for 2 young Brennari mechanics he was taking on as apprentices. Reed kept the cracked old field coil from the cabin drawer and the canvas shoes and the certificate of transfer from the Valegan slaver and the small bronze caduceus pin Lyra had given him in the galley. He moved his belongings into a quarter cabin on the Anita, the Marili humanitarian carrier, a long, sleek ship with the pale blue lattice markings, and he became her pilot. The work was not work in any sense that paid. The work was the kind of work that had, for 9 years, been his refusal. The Anita ran a regular 3-month circuit between 5 enclaves and the Velen refuge on Bretza. He carried, on each circuit, between 4 and 12 rescued Marili children, sometimes other species when the manifest broadened, almost always children, almost always young. He learned the name of every child he carried. He took small interest in their preferences in stew. He learned a careful number of phrases in fluent Marili, enough to greet a 6-year-old and tell her she was safe, enough to ask if a sleeping child was in pain. He did not speak in those phrases unless he needed to. He flew the Anita the way he had flown the hollow knife, with both hands, with the patience of a man who had spent his furnace and was now running on something steadier than fire. He saw Lyra often. She was the medical officer aboard the Anita on every other circuit. They worked together with the easy quiet of 2 people who had figured out a long time ago that they were going to be in each other's lives in some shape, and that the shape did not need to be named to be honored. They were not lovers. They had not been on the cabin deck of the hollow knife, and they were not on the deck of the Anita. They were, in some way that the common galactic word friend did not quite cover, kin. Reed worked for the Velen refuge for the rest of his working life. He flew the Anita for 19 years. He was 62 when he handed the controls to a young Marili pilot they had finished training, and he climbed down the ramp of the Anita for the last time as her acting captain. He bought a small place on Bretza, on the same continent as the Velen refuge, a strip of land near a quiet stream, and he kept a small garden, and he kept a small dog he named Velen, who was a foundling with one bad eye and a calm temperament. He raised vegetables for the refugee kitchens. He came in once a week to teach engineering to the older children. He did not become a public figure. The Marili holdings did not make him a public figure. Lyra Marili, by then the chief healer of the Velen refuge, came over for a meal once a month and brought stew. He cooked sometimes too. He cooked slowly, lentil and root with cumin, the way Anita had liked it. And the small dog Velen sat at his feet, and Lyra Marili sat across from him at his small table, and they ate on the porch of his small place. When he was very old, he thought sometimes about the Valegan slaver alley. He thought about the 3rd pole on the left side. He thought about the chained girl in the ash-gray shift with the silver streak at her temple, and the patience in her eyes that had told him she did not expect a man who turned around to be a man who would help. He thought about the 8,400 salt credits and the multitool and the boots and the cracked field coil that had not, in the end, been the worst trade of his working life, but the best. He thought about Anita. He thought about Velen. He thought about his mother who had taught him, in the colony moon kitchen of his 13th year, that what you did was who you were. He thought, of all the things a man does in a life, the small ones turn out to be the work. He had not been a hero. He had only stopped once, on a midday in a slaver alley, when a small voice had asked him to. The galaxy had remembered him longer than he had remembered himself. He had not made the trade he set out to make. He had made the trade that had made him. He had given away salt credits and tools and boots and 40 barefoot meters in the dust of Vakar. and he had been given, in exchange, a sister he had not known how to keep, an exit from a furnace he had not known how to bank, and the long, quiet years of carrying small lavender children to a refuge that had been named for a girl who had not come home. The chain in the alley was gone. The cuff was gone. The certificate was in a wooden box on the shelf above the kitchen door, with the canvas shoes and the cracked field coil and the small bronze caduceus pin. What remained was the soft hum of a kettle on the stove, and a small dog asleep on the porch, and a stew thickening in the pot, and a healer who would arrive at his door on the 8th of the month. He had been enough. That had been enough. That had, in the end, been everything.